It was June 19, 1953. The clock was ticking in Sing Sing prison, but outside the world seemed to stand still. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the prison walls as two lives, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were about to be extinguished forever. Two lives that would leave an indelible mark on history. But who were they really? And why was this moment so crucial? Julius, a devoted father and skilled engineer, and Ethel, a mother caught in the whirlwind of fear and suspicion, were accused of betraying their country. They were convicted of giving atomic secrets to the Soviets during one of the most fraught times in history, the Cold War. But what was the truth? Were they guilty of espionage? Or had they simply become pawns in a game far bigger than themselves? The trial had been a spectacle, every word dissected by the press. People debated in the streets, were they spies? Or were they victims of a government trying to send a message? And as the world held its breath, their fate was sealed. The state had made its decision, and the Rosenbergs would pay with their lives. The moment Julius stepped into that room, the tension was unbearable. His final words, "I am innocent," rang out in the cold silence, but there was no one left to listen. The switch was thrown and the current surged through him. A life cut short just like that. But it wasn't over. Ethel's execution would become a haunting chapter in this already tragic story. She didn't die immediately. The first shock didn't take. Her body twitched, struggling against the inevitable. Witnesses later recalled the smoke rising from her hair, a moment that would stay with them forever. It took 3 more shocks before Ethel finally went still, a haunting image of pain and injustice. These were not just 2 names on a list. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were real people with families, dreams, and lives interrupted by fear and suspicion. As the world watched, their deaths became a symbol of a time when the truth was buried beneath paranoia and power. But here's the question that still lingers. Were they innocent, or did they deserve their fate? History has tried to answer that question, but the truth is far from clear. What do you think? Were Julius and Ethel guilty, or were they caught in the crossfire of a nation's fear? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let's dive into this mystery together. If you're as captivated by this story as we are, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell for more true crime stories that leave you questioning everything. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's execution was a moment that would forever stain the pages of American history. But what led to that final heart-wrenching moment? How did a couple, once living ordinary lives, find themselves at the center of a world-altering trial? The Cold War was a time of paranoia, fear, and suspicion. The Soviet Union had become America's greatest threat, and in the climate of mutual distrust, even the smallest accusation could destroy a life. Julius, a former army engineer, had been accused of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets, secrets that could potentially turn the tide of the war. Ethel, his wife, was accused of being complicit, a bystander dragged into her husband's alleged espionage. But was it all true? Or was this just another product of Cold War hysteria? The government seemed so sure of their guilt, but the evidence was anything but solid. In fact, many believed that Julius was the main target, and Ethel was merely a victim of circumstance used as leverage against her husband. During the trial, the media buzzed with the story. Headlines screamed of treason, of betrayal, but what about the details? What about the lack of physical evidence and the questionable testimonies? As the prosecution's case crumbled under scrutiny, the world began to question if they were really guilty, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yet, the verdict was delivered, and the Rosenbergs were sentenced to death. It wasn't just their lives on the line, it was the very notion of justice. How could a couple with 2 young children be condemned to die without undeniable proof? There were protests. Celebrities like Albert Einstein and Paul Robeson spoke out in their defense. But the government had made its decision, and no one could sway the scales of justice. As Julius stepped into the electric chair, the world held its breath. The switch was thrown. His body went still. The sentence was carried out. And yet, there was still a lingering question in the air. Was the price of justice worth the cost of a life, 2 lives? Ethel's turn came shortly after, and the execution was far more gruesome than anyone could have anticipated. Her body didn't fall silent immediately. She twitched. Her eyes remained open as she struggled against the shock, smoke rising from her hair. The witnesses were shaken, but there was nothing they could do. After 4 shocks, Ethel's life ended. But her death would not be the end of the story. The controversy surrounding their execution would last long after that fateful night. Were the Rosenbergs the victims of a government more interested in making a statement than pursuing justice? Or were they guilty of treason, deserving of the punishment they received? These questions still echo today, but one thing is for sure. Their deaths marked a turning point in how America viewed its own justice system. What do you think? Were Julius and Ethel guilty of espionage, or did they fall victim to a time when fear clouded reason? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The Rosenbergs' execution wasn't just a simple act of justice. It became a flashpoint for a nation already teetering on the edge of paranoia. It wasn't just about Julius and Ethel anymore. It was about fear, ideology, and the power of the state. And the more you look at their case, the more questions arise. What drove the government to act with such certainty? Was it a need to send a message about the dangers of communism, or was it the result of flawed intelligence and the politics of fear? Julius, an electrical engineer, had worked on atomic secrets. The charge was serious and the stakes were higher than ever. But where was the hard evidence? The case against them was built on the testimony of spies who had themselves been caught in lies, and the majority of the physical evidence remained circumstantial at best. Many believed that Julius had been involved with the Soviets. But what about Ethel? Was she truly complicit, or was she a pawn in a game of political chess? There were no definitive answers, but the government was determined to make an example of them. The conviction was swift, and the death sentence followed soon after. Public opinion was divided. Some saw them as traitors who betrayed their country during one of its most vulnerable moments. Others, like famed scientists Albert Einstein and Linus Pauling, believed they were innocent victims of a Cold War witch hunt. As the countdown to their execution began, more and more voices spoke out, calling for clemency, but none of them were heard. In the end, Julius was the first to be executed. His last words were simple but heavy: "I am innocent." The switch was thrown and his life ended in an instant, his words silenced forever. But Ethel's death would prove far more controversial. Witnesses later reported the horror they witnessed. The first shock didn't kill her. Her body convulsed in agony. Smoke rose from her head, and it took 2 more shocks before she was finally still. The executioners had no choice but to proceed, but to those who witnessed it, it was nothing short of barbaric. There was no doubt that the execution was brutal. But what about the death of their souls? What had led them to this point? Were they truly guilty, or were they simply victims of a time when fear trumped reason? That question still lingers unanswered even decades later. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed not just as criminals, but as symbols. Their deaths became part of the fabric of the Cold War, a stark reminder of the price of fear and the cost of justice. But who truly paid the price? Was it the Rosenbergs, or was it America itself? What's your take on this? Were they unjustly executed, or did they get what they deserved? We want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you're captivated by this case, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into the shadows of history. The execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg marked a turning point, but their story didn't end that night. The questions raised by their deaths are still reverberating, echoing through history and politics even today. What made their case so controversial wasn't just the action of their execution, but the implications it carried for the entire justice system. In the years following their deaths, new revelations began to surface. Soviet intelligence files became public, and it was revealed that Julius had indeed been involved in espionage. But the big question remained: was Ethel truly guilty? The evidence against her was slim, and many believed she was nothing more than a pawn in a much larger political game. Yet, despite these revelations, there is still a lingering feeling that justice wasn't served. The Rosenbergs had 2 young children, and they were executed despite the growing doubts about their guilt. In the decades since, some have come to view the Rosenbergs as martyrs, victims of a paranoid government bent on making an example out of them. Others, however, still believe that their crimes were too great to ignore, no matter how flawed the trial may have been. But regardless of where you fall on the debate, one thing is clear. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were victims of their time. In an era defined by fear, suspicion, and political divisions, they were caught in a storm they never fully understood. Their deaths were a grim symbol of the Cold War's chilling reach and the lengths to which governments would go to protect their secrets. What does this case tell us about the justice system? About the lengths a country will go to in the name of security? And what can we learn from the Rosenbergs' tragic end? These are questions we're still trying to answer decades later. So, what do you think? Were the Rosenbergs martyrs for justice, or were they traitors deserving of their fate? Let us know in the comments. And if you're hooked on this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into a case that still raises more questions than answers.